Different economies have different advantages and disadvantages to the player. I'm going to be breaking down what these mean to you in the second part of this series on card game economics, brought to you by Artifact Academy.
Interesting.
The master!
Are you ready to have some fun?
Let's go to work!
Before we get started, I just want to quickly tell you this is the second part of a series. You don't have to watch the first one, but the link is below if you want to check that one out. I also have a survey that I'm doing as part of this series. If you fill that out, you have a chance to win a $10 Steam gift card. And, of course, there's an article associated with this video, so please check that out if you want a little bit more detail. So the topic of this video is economic systems, and what the objective here is to break down the various types of economies that we see in different card games and group them together. There are different economies in every different game, but I think that they can be grouped together in some broad categories. So I'm going to identify what those are, break down what the advantages and disadvantages are of each of them, and then finally talk about how this might apply to Artifact and what we can learn about Artifact from this analysis. So let's start with trading card games. Some of you may not know this, but part of the inspiration for trading card games, the way they're implemented now, actually came from Dr. Garfield when he was making Magic, taking some inspiration from sports trading cards. This may seem obvious, kind of looking at things from the big picture, but this connection has a surprising amount of implications when you think about it in terms of how it impacts the economy of the game as a whole. To illustrate this, let's talk about an extreme example, Black Lotus. This is one of the rarest and most expensive cards in any trading card game. Now, the question really obviously becomes, why is it so rare? Why doesn't Wizards of the Coast just print a bunch more of these and make a ton of money? The players would be happy because they'd have more copies to play with. But in some ways, this kind of compromises the collecting side of the game, which may not be a particularly compelling argument, though, if you're just thinking about this as being a game. Despite this, Wizards of the Coast has continually sided with the collecting side of this and not really compromised the collector's investment in the game. Now, those of you who, of course, know this situation with Black Lotus and about the reserve list know that things are a little bit more complicated in this particular spot, but it begs the question of why doesn't Wizards of the Coast just cash in a lot of other cards that they could and just print them when they're in demand and make a bunch of short-term profits that way. And I think that it has some interesting impacts on the overall ecosystem of the economy and of the game, as we'll see later on, and you might see some of the reasons for why they might do that within that discussion. This brings us to our second type of economy, dusting systems. Those of you who know the history know that Blizzard once upon a time had a WoW TCG that had mediocre success. They planned, though, to bring it to a mobile format, and they wanted to remove some of the complexity of trading so that it will be better suited for this format. What they came up with was the dusting system. So how does this work? Well, what the game allows you to do is take an unwanted card, grind it up, turn it into arcane dust, which you can then turn into a wanted card for your collection. Now, the conversion rates aren't great. Usually you get about 1/4 of your return back in most games, as is the case with Hearthstone, but this gave you a lot of flexibility in what you do with your collection and allowed you to build the cards that you wanted. As is often the case with Blizzard games, there are a lot of other companies that took some inspiration from the system and made some improvements on it as well. Games like Shadowverse, Gwent, and Eternal all use a similar economy system with some minor improvements and tweaks. Even Magic the Gathering Arena, which has a pretty different take on this, I think is ultimately at its core a modified dusting system. The last model I want to talk about is the living card game model, which is a term that's actually trademarked by Fantasy Flight Games, although other game companies are able to use this model as well. They were working on the game Blue Moon, and they felt that the trading model didn't work in their game. Well, they still wanted to have a collectible / deck building component. So what they decided to do is actually just sell you all of the cards in one box. Kind of made it a combination and cross between a board game and a trading card game in some ways, but it worked really well for this and allowed them to adopt it for other games that they were working on too. Some of the other titles that use this model include Android Netrunner, Star Wars card game, and a Game of Thrones card game. This model is particularly good for these styles of IP-driven titles because it means that every player will get a copy of Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader if they're just a fan of the franchise and aren't as invested in the game. Of titles that are currently available that use the living card game economic model, although it's not made by Fantasy Flight Games, it's Epic. I think that it has a pretty decent competitive scene right now if you want to check that one out. Now that we've been introduced to each of these systems, let's do some comparisons and grade these systems on various categories. Now, before we get into this, I just want to make clear it's not about finding a perfect system necessarily and grading them relative to one another. Overall, really just trying to identify what's the best strengths and weaknesses of each as we're trying to understand how this applies to artifacts specifically, which is our goal. The first axis I want to compare these on is complexity. The complexity of trading card games is actually through the roof. You have websites and YouTube channels and subreddits all dedicated to the specialized subject. Now, there are a lot of people who are passionate about this, but if you're talking about it just as a game, this is kind of a barrier to a lot of people, and especially beginners. This is why I gave it an F. This is the lowest grade in the entire review. I think this is a real serious barrier for players playing in trading card games because they just don't like managing their collection like this. The next system, the dusting system, there's a little bit of complexity of deciding whether you want to take a card and dust it or not at a given point. Ultimately, this isn't that hard though. I would give this a B+ because it's pretty intuitive to new players. Next system, of course, living card games. You can just go back into the box, get whatever cards you want, build a new deck. Really dirt simple. Just buy the cards that are legal in the sets right now and you're good to go. So they get an A. Our next category is deck switching, which is a measure of how punished you are economically when you're going from one deck to another. Trading card games, this is pretty easy. You can just trade with your friends or other people at the store. You can go through buy lists and vendors to do this. And if you actually pay attention to the value, you don't really lose too much. So it's pretty good. For dust-based economies, deck switching is really punishing. As I mentioned, about 3/4 of your value is erased every time that you're getting rid of a card and transitioning it through dust. So as a result, they're getting a score of D in this category. Of course, though, in living card games, you have an excellent time switching decks, given the fact that you can just go back into the box and build something new. A+ for living card games under deck switching. Now let's talk about cost. This is just focusing on the cost of building a deck from scratch rather than maintaining a collection. So in this mind, Magic is really expensive. Everybody knows this is a pretty expensive hobby. But if you haven't looked around, other card games, trading card games are pretty expensive too. I did some looking around at Yu-Gi-Oh! Those prices aren't cheap either. It's pretty common that you get some high prices for this. So I have a score of D in this category for trading card games. For dust-based games, you actually have an option to play entirely free-to-play, which you don't get in many other games. So as a result, I've given them an A- score. Now, I do know there are some games that aren't truly really free-to-play, if my eyes on you, Hearthstone, but the fact that this is even an option means that I think that's a step above the rest. For living card games, there are some of them that you have to keep up with a lot of expansions. There's regular releases that happen. Still way cheaper than trading card games, but I think it's a little bit behind the dust-based games in terms of the cost of getting involved. Now let's talk about the ability to resell your collection, which means how much value you can get out of your collection if you decide that you don't want some specific cards or you just don't want to play the game anymore altogether. For trading card games, this actually isn't very bad because you can just sell your collection to some big store of some sort. You can even do this online in MTGO if you're playing there, so it does quite well in that regard. Comparing this to something like dust-based games, it's really bad. Gone through this idea of the 1/4 rule if you're trying to change between cards that you don't want for cards that you do want. It's really brutal, but if you put any money into the game, you really have no way to get it back out again. As a result, you get a D in this category for dust-based games. For living card games, I did a little bit of looking to see if you could really sell these online. There's not very much of a market for it. It's really hard to get any value back out of these after you buy them, so as a result, the resale-ability is about the same as dust, which is D. Now let's talk about collectability, which is just a measure of how fun and interesting is it to collect these different types of cards. In the case of trading card games, this is really sweet. I mean, that's largely because these are all physical cards that you can see and hold, but you get the impression of like, yeah, I'm holding a really rare card. This is awesome. As a result, get A in this category. Dust-based games put a lot of effort into trying to get some of that collector's appeal through fancy animations and cool premium graphics, etc. Still doesn't feel the same though. I give it a C+ grade personally. There are some titles within living card games that do have special promotions with foil cards or special premiums. I still don't really feel like these are a great attraction for collector's items because you really know you're getting them already. So I give these a C- because it really just doesn't have the same impact as something like you get in a trading card game. Our last category is competitive play or organized play. Trading card games do this spectacularly well, whether it's a large tournament like Grand Prix or even at the local store. And it's not just Magic either. Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon both have really good competitive scenes. Why is this? Well, I think that the Star City Games Open Series is a good example to help understand this. This is a tournament series that's associated with the website, but the tournament series helps you fund the website that sells the cards because they sell cards at the events, they buy cards at the events, this stocks the website, this website can then promote the tournament series, etc., etc. You have a really nice ecosystem here. This has allowed trading card games to have a really vibrant, organized play experience, and although Magic's competitive scene specifically isn't perfect, it's much better than what it could be. So with this, I'm going to be giving it an A. Let's compare this to a game like Hearthstone. Relative to the size of the game, the competitive scene in Hearthstone is not actually that strong. Part of this relates to choices made by Blizzard, especially in the early years of the game, but really it relies on these outside sponsors for a lot of events to be successful because you can't really have as much of this internally self-sufficient profit model like you saw in the Star City Games series. Other dust-based economy games have had some amount of competitive scenes like Gwent and Shadowverse, but these really haven't been massive, all things considered. The score that I give in this particular category is a C+. For living card games, the competitive scene doesn't seem to be particularly strong. There are some small tournaments here and there. Epic does seem to have a reasonable tournament series, not that massive though. All things considered, I think they're in last place in this particular category. So with that, we can get a bit of a summary of all the scores that we got here. I'd just like to note that these last few scores are actually, I think, tied together in my mind. So that's collectability, competitiveness, and the resell-ability of this, which really relates to the connection between the retail side and the competitive scene side of the games. So what about Artifact then, specifically? There are a couple of comments I want to bring out before we end here. The first is about cost. Most of the trading-based games, obviously Artifact's a trading-based game, that I've been talking about here are actually tied to paper in some way, which makes a pretty big difference. Even MTGO is kind of tied to paper in its own perverted way. The only one that I know of that is entirely not connected to paper is Hex, which is pretty affordable if you look at the prices of that one. So it might be the case that the prices of Artifact decks more closely resemble that, which is pretty cheap. And finally, I want to talk about what this could mean for the competitive scene of Artifact. Clearly, trading-based card games have a lot of opportunity there, but it depends on the way in which things are organized. You could imagine that the Star City Games model could be taken up by some Artifact-specific property, like this one. But the way in which things are wired together makes a pretty big difference. This is something going into a little bit more detail in the article, but you can see how the potential is there, assuming that Valve gets everything right. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. This, of course, is brought to you by Artifact Academy. Like, share, subscribe to help this video get some recognition. Share your thoughts on Reddit or in the comment section. I'd love the feedback to give direction for the future of this series. Be sure to fill out the survey that you can find in the links below if you haven't had a chance yet. Check out the article if you'd like more detail on this. Lots of links below. Once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Take care, everybody.